This simple 1889 portrait seemed peaceful, until you noticed the mother's hands. Dr. James Coleman opened the climate-controlled storage drawer at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History on a humid morning in July 2024. He was conducting a routine survey of the museum's collection of 19th-century vernacular photography, ordinary family portraits donated over decades by descendants clearing out attics and estates. The drawer contained approximately 200 photographs from the 1880s and 1890s, most of them standard cabinet cards showing stiffly posed families in their Sunday finest. Coleman's task was to catalog each image, noting any unique characteristics that might warrant further research or exhibition consideration. He lifted photograph number 147 from its protective sleeve. The image measured 8 by 10 inches, mounted on heavy cardboard backing. The reverse side bore a photographer's mark, Morrison and Sons Photography, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and a handwritten notation, The Patterson Family, April 1889. The photograph showed a family of 4 arranged in a formal studio setting. A man in his mid-30s stood behind a upholstered chair, his right hand resting on the chair's back. He wore a dark suit with a high collar and showed no expression, typical of the era's photographic conventions. Seated in the chair was a woman of similar age, dressed in a high-necked dark dress with a cameo brooch at the collar. Her face was turned toward the camera, eyes open, expression neutral. 2 children were positioned on either side of the seated woman. On her right stood a boy of approximately 10 years, wearing a dark jacket and knickers. On her left stood a girl of about 6, in a white dress with a dark sash. Both children looked directly at the camera with serious expressions. Coleman almost returned the photograph to its sleeve when something caught his attention. He reached for his magnifying glass and examined the image more closely. The woman's hands rested in her lap, but they were not relaxed in the typical manner of posed portrait subjects. Both hands were clenched into tight fists, the knuckles clearly visible even in the sepia-toned image. The positioning seemed awkward, unnatural, as if the hands had been placed there deliberately, but could not be arranged in a more natural pose. Coleman felt a familiar sensation, the recognition that something about this seemingly ordinary photograph was not what it appeared to be. He pulled his laptop closer and began his investigation. Coleman photographed the image with his high-resolution camera, capturing details not visible to the naked eye. He then enlarged the digital file on his computer screen, examining each section of the photograph systematically. The clenched fists were even more apparent under magnification. The woman's thumbs were tucked inside her fingers, a position that required deliberate effort to maintain. In typical portrait photography of the period, subjects' hands were usually positioned with fingers gently curved or folded, creating a soft, relaxed appearance. Photographers gave specific instructions about hand placement because awkward hands could ruin an otherwise acceptable portrait. These fists were rigid, tense, completely contrary to photographic conventions of 1889. Coleman examined the woman's face next. Her eyes were open and appeared to be looking at the camera, but there was something unusual about the gaze. The eyes seemed unfocused, not quite making contact with the lens. Her facial muscles appeared slack, particularly around the mouth and jaw. The overall effect was of someone present but not entirely there. He shifted his attention to the family members around her. The husband's hand on the chair back was positioned in a way that seemed to steady the chair rather than rest casually upon it. The children's expressions were not merely serious. They were strained, almost frightened. The girl's hand nearest to her mother appeared to be gripping her mother's shoulder, as if holding her in place. Coleman had spent 15 years studying 19th century photography, including several years focused specifically on post-mortem photography. He recognized the signs. This woman was dead. The clenched fists were the result of rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles that occurs 2 to 6 hours after death and can last up to 72 hours. The photographer had attempted to position the hands naturally in the woman's lap, but the muscular rigidity had made it impossible to open the fists. Rather than abandon the session or wait for the rigor to pass, the photographer had proceeded with the hands in their contracted state, hoping the detail would not be too obvious in the final image. Coleman pulled up the museum's acquisition records for this photograph. It had been donated in 1987 by a woman named Helen Patterson, who had identified it as a portrait of her great-grandparents. The donation form included no mention of it being a post-mortem photograph. Coleman began researching the Patterson family and the circumstances that might have led to this photograph. He started with the photographer's mark, Morrison and Sons Photography, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, April 1889. He accessed the Pennsylvania State Archives digital collection and found business directories for Harrisburg. Morrison and Sons had operated a photography studio on Market Street from 1883 to 1897. An advertisement from an 1888 newspaper listed their services: portraits, family groups, cabinet cards, memorial photography. Memorial photography, the Victorian euphemism for post-mortem photographs. Coleman next searched for the Patterson family in the 1890 United States Census, working backward from the 1889 photograph date. He found an entry for George Patterson, age 34, listed as head of household in Harrisburg's 4th Ward. The household included 2 children, Robert, age 10, and Margaret, age 6. The wife's name was listed as deceased. Coleman felt the familiar weight of confirmation. He requested death records from the Dauphin County Register of Wills. Within 3 days, he received a digital scan of the death certificate for Elizabeth Patterson, née Morgan, who had died on April 9, 1889, at age 32. Cause of death: puerperal fever following childbirth. The term was common in 19th century medical records. Puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, was a bacterial infection that occurred after childbirth, usually caused by unsanitary conditions during delivery or postpartum care. Before the widespread adoption of antiseptic practices in the 1890s, puerperal fever killed thousands of women annually in the United States. Mortality rates ranged from 10 to 35% of all women who contracted the infection. Coleman found additional records. Elizabeth Patterson had given birth to a stillborn infant on April 6, 1889. She had developed fever and complications within 24 hours. Despite the attending physician's efforts, the infection had spread rapidly. She died 3 days after delivery. The photograph had been taken on April 11, 1889, 2 days after her death. George Patterson had commissioned the memorial portrait, bringing his dead wife's body to the photography studio along with his 2 surviving children, to create one final image of the family together. Coleman contacted Dr. Sarah Weinberg, a colleague at the Library of Congress who specialized in 19th century photographic processes and post-mortem photography practices. He sent her high-resolution scans of the Patterson photograph and asked for her technical analysis. Weinberg's response arrived 2 days later via email, accompanied by a detailed technical report. The Patterson photograph presents several characteristics consistent with post-mortem work from the late 1880s, she wrote. However, it also shows evidence of significant technical challenges that the photographer attempted to overcome with varying degrees of success. Her analysis identified specific elements. The woman's body had been transported to the studio and positioned in the chair using methods common to post-mortem photography. Small braces or supports, likely hidden behind the chair and beneath the dress, would have held the torso upright. The photographer had positioned the husband's hand on the chair back, not just for compositional purposes, but to add stability to the setup. The open eyes indicated that the photographer had attempted to create the appearance of life, rather than peaceful sleep. This was less common in post-mortem work, but not unheard of, particularly when the surviving spouse wanted the photograph to look like a normal family portrait. Some photographers used small prosthetic devices to hold eyelids open, though this technique was difficult and often produced the unfocused gaze visible in this image. The clenched fists, however, represented a failure of technique. Weinberg explained, "Rigor mortis typically begins 2 to 6 hours after death and reaches maximum rigidity at approximately 12 hours. It then gradually diminishes over the next 48 to 72 hours. The photographer appears to have conducted this session during the peak of rigor mortis, when the muscles were at their stiffest. The hands had contracted into fists, and no amount of manipulation could open them without potentially damaging the tissue. The photographer faced a choice: wait another day or 2 for the rigor to pass or proceed with the session as scheduled. He chose to proceed, positioning the closed fists in the woman's lap and hoping they would not be too noticeable in the final image. Weinberg noted one additional detail. The children's positioning and expression suggests they were aware their mother was dead. The girl's hand on her mother's shoulder appears to be providing additional support to keep the body stable during the exposure. This kind of family participation in staging postmortem photographs was not uncommon, but it must have been deeply traumatic for children of that age. Coleman requested additional medical records from the Pennsylvania State Archives, seeking to understand the full circumstances of Elizabeth Patterson's death. He obtained records from Harrisburg Hospital, which had treated Elizabeth during her final illness. The hospital admission record, dated April 7, 1889, noted, Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson, age 32, admitted with severe fever, chills, and abdominal pain following delivery of stillborn infant on April 6. Patient delivered at home with midwife attending. Placenta manually removed after prolonged retention. Fever began approximately 18 hours post-delivery. The attending physician's notes documented the progression of the infection. April 7th, temperature 104 degrees. Patient delirious at intervals. Administered quinine and laudanum for fever and pain. Prognosis grave. April 8th, temperature remains elevated at 103 degrees. Patient increasingly weak. Pulse rapid and thready. Infection appears to be spreading. Applied cold compresses. Little hope for recovery. April 9th, patient expired at 6:20 a.m. Cause of death, septicemia secondary to puerperal infection. Notified husband and family. Coleman found the death particularly tragic because by 1889, the medical community was beginning to understand the bacterial nature of puerperal fever and the importance of antiseptic practices during childbirth. Ignaz Semmelweis had demonstrated in the 1840s that hand washing with chlorinated lime solution dramatically reduced mortality rates. Joseph Lister had promoted antiseptic surgical techniques throughout the 1870s and 1880s. However, these practices spread slowly, particularly in home births attended by midwives who lacked formal medical training. Many women continued to die from infections that could have been prevented with basic sanitation. Elizabeth Patterson's death was documented in the Harrisburg Daily Patriot newspaper on April 10, 1889. Died. On April 9th, Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson, beloved wife of George Patterson and mother of 2 children, aged 32 years. Death resulted from childbed fever following a difficult labor. Funeral services to be held at the family residence on Thursday, April 11th, at 2 p.m. Interment at Harrisburg Cemetery. The funeral and the photography session had occurred on the same day. Coleman began to understand the logistics. The funeral service in the afternoon, followed by a trip to Morrison & Sons photography studio before the burial, allowing the family to create one final portrait. Coleman traveled to Harrisburg to examine local historical society archives, hoping to find additional information about Morrison & Sons photography and their memorial photography practice. The Historical Society of Dauphin County maintained records from several defunct businesses, including photographic studios. He found 3 ledger books from Morrison & Sons, covering 1885 to 1895. The ledgers documented each photography session with client name, date, type of photograph, number of prints ordered, and payment received. The entry for April 11, 1889 read, Patterson, George, Memorial Family Portrait, 4 subjects, 1 deceased, 2 8x10 prints, 6 cabinet cards. Total, $15. Balance due, $5. $15 was a substantial sum in 1889, equivalent to approximately $450 in 2024 currency. The notation, balance due, indicated George Patterson had paid $10 at the time of the session and owed an additional $5 when the photographs were delivered. Coleman found one additional notation in the ledger's margin, written in different handwriting and apparently added later. Difficult session. Rigor present. Client insisted on open eyes. Final result acceptable but not optimal. Children distressed throughout. This margin note provided rare insight into the photographer's experience. Memorial photography was emotionally challenging work under the best circumstances. This session had been complicated by technical difficulties, the rigor mortis that made positioning the body difficult, and by the presence of 2 young children who had to pose alongside their dead mother. Coleman searched through the ledgers for other memorial photography entries. Morrison & Sons had averaged approximately 8 to 12 memorial sessions per year between 1885 and 1895, most of them involving deceased children or infants. Adult memorial photography was less common, and memorial photographs of mothers who had died in childbirth were rare enough that this session had warranted a specific margin note. The photographer's comment that the final result, acceptable but not optimal, suggested professional frustration. The clenched fists had been visible enough to bother him, even if the client had accepted the photographs. Coleman wondered if George Patterson had noticed the fists, or if in his grief he had been able to see only his wife's face, preserved one final time before burial. Coleman wanted to understand what had happened to the Patterson family after Elizabeth's death. He traced the family through subsequent census records city directories, and genealogical databases. The 1900 census showed George Patterson, now age 45, still living in Harrisburg with his 2 children, now ages 21 and 17. His occupation was listed as factory foreman at a local steel mill. No wife was listed. He had not remarried. Robert Patterson, the son, had left home by 1910, moving to Pittsburgh to work as a machinist. Margaret Patterson, the daughter, had married in 1904 at age 21 and moved to Philadelphia with her husband. Coleman found something unexpected in the archives of the Historical Society of Dauphin County, a collection of personal papers donated by Margaret Patterson's granddaughter in 1978. The collection included letters, photographs, and a small diary that Margaret had kept as a young woman. He requested access to the diary. It was a slim volume bound in faded cloth, with entries dating from 1895 to 1902, beginning when Margaret was 12 years old. The earliest entries were typical of a young girl's diary: observations about school, friends, household chores, complaints about her brother. But in an entry dated April 11, 1896, 7 years after her mother's death, Margaret had written something that made Coleman pause. "Today is the anniversary of Mother's death and the day we took the photograph. I am 13 now, and I still have nightmares about that day. Father took Robert and me to the photographer's studio after the funeral. Mother's body was in a chair, dressed in her best dress. Her eyes were open, but they did not see anything. Her hands were closed tight, and the photographer could not open them. He kept trying, pulling at her fingers, but they would not move. I started crying, and Father told me to be quiet, that we needed this photograph to remember Mother. I stood next to her chair and put my hand on her shoulder like the photographer told me to. Her shoulder was cold through the fabric of her dress. The whole time I wanted to run away, but I stayed because Father said we must. When the photograph was finished, I ran outside and was sick in the street. Robert says he does not remember that day clearly, but I remember everything. I wish I could forget." Coleman sat back, feeling the weight of the child's trauma. Margaret had been 6 years old, forced to pose with her mother's corpse for a photograph that her father believed was necessary to preserve the family's memory. Coleman expanded his research to understand the broader social context that had made the Patterson photograph possible and seemingly necessary to George Patterson. Victorian American culture had developed elaborate practices around death and mourning, particularly in the period from 1840 to 1910. Death occurred frequently and visibly. Average life expectancy was approximately 47 years. Infant and childhood mortality rates were high. Women frequently died in childbirth. Infectious diseases killed quickly and without warning. Because death was so common, society developed rituals to help families process grief and maintain connections with the dead. These rituals included specific mourning clothing, black garments worn for months or years, mourning jewelry, lockets containing hair from the deceased, memorial cards, and post-mortem photography. Post-mortem photography served multiple functions. It provided a visual record of the deceased for family members who could not attend the funeral. It created a permanent memorial when no previous photographs existed. For parents who lost children, it offered consolation, a way to see their child at peace rather than remembering the suffering of illness or injury. But post-mortem photography of adults, particularly spouses, was more complex. The photographs represented the surviving spouse's attempt to maintain the appearance of an intact family despite the death. They served as evidence that the family had existed in a complete form, even if only briefly. Coleman found contemporary discussions of post-mortem photography in magazines and advice books from the 1880s and 1890s. Most defended the practice as appropriate and comforting. An 1887 article in Godey's Ladies' Book stated, "The memorial photograph preserves the features of our beloved departed as they appeared in life, providing consolation to those left behind and serving as a precious heirloom for future generations." However, some voices expressed concern about the psychological impact, particularly on children. An 1892 article in the Ladies' Home Journal cautioned, "While memorial photography may provide comfort to bereaved parents, one must consider the effect upon young children who witness these proceedings. The sight of a deceased parent or sibling arranged as if living may cause lasting distress and confusion in tender minds." Margaret Patterson's diary entry suggested that this warning was well-founded. Her trauma from participating in the photograph session had persisted for years. Coleman traced how the Patterson photograph had traveled from George Patterson's possession in 1889 to the Smithsonian's collection in 2024. George Patterson had kept the photograph displayed in his home until his death in 1923. According to probate records, his personal effects were divided between his two children. Robert received his father's tools and professional items. Margaret received household furnishings and family photographs. Margaret, by then age 40 and living in Philadelphia with her husband and 3 children, had placed the photograph in a trunk with other family memorabilia. Based on her diary entries, she had complex feelings about the image. It represented both her mother and her childhood trauma. In a letter Margaret wrote to her daughter Ruth in 1945, she addressed the photograph directly. "Among the items in the old trunk, you will find a photograph of your grandfather, grandmother, Uncle Robert, and myself, taken in 1889 when I was 6 years old. I must tell you something about this photograph that you may find disturbing. Your grandmother had died 2 days before the photograph was taken. She is dead in that picture, though her eyes are open and she is positioned as if alive. I know this seems strange and perhaps morbid to your generation, but in my childhood, such photographs were common. Your grandfather wanted one final image of our family together. I have kept this photograph for 56 years, even though looking at it still causes me pain. I keep it because it is the only photograph I have of my mother, and despite the circumstances, I am grateful to have her face preserved. When I die, you may decide whether to keep it or destroy it. I will not judge your choice." Ruth had kept the photograph. When she died in 1985, her daughter Helen inherited the family collection. Helen, unclear about the photograph's significance and uncomfortable with her great-grandmother's letter, had donated the entire collection to the Smithsonian in 1987, describing it simply as 19th century family photographs. The photograph had sat in storage for 37 years until Coleman's survey brought it back to light. Coleman prepared a comprehensive research report on the Patterson photograph, documenting its history, context, and significance. His report would become part of the Smithsonian's permanent record and would inform any future exhibition or publication featuring the image. He titled the report, "The Patterson Family Memorial Portrait: Post-Mortem Photography, Maternal Mortality, and Victorian Mourning Practices in 1889 America." The report's conclusion stated, "The Patterson photograph represents a confluence of 19th century American experiences, high maternal mortality rates, limited medical interventions for childbed fever, Victorian mourning customs, and the practice of post-mortem photography. The visible evidence of rigor mortis in Elizabeth Patterson's clenched fists, a detail the photographer could not correct, provides rare documentation of the technical challenges of memorial photography and the sometimes awkward gap between Victorian ideals of beautiful, peaceful death and the physical realities of the corpse. Most significantly, this photograph exists not in isolation, but with accompanying documentation of its traumatic impact on the surviving children, particularly 6-year-old Margaret Patterson, whose diary entries reveal lasting psychological effects from participating in the photograph session. This makes the Patterson photograph an important historical document not only of memorial photography practices, but of childhood trauma and the complex emotional landscape of Victorian death culture. The photograph has value for multiple fields of historical inquiry: medical history, puerperal fever and maternal mortality; social history, working-class family life in industrial Pennsylvania; photographic history, post-mortem photography techniques; and psychological history, childhood experience of death and trauma. Coleman recommended that if the photograph were ever exhibited, it should be accompanied by full contextual information, including Elizabeth's cause of death, the circumstances of the photography session, and Margaret's testimony about her experience. 6 months later, the Smithsonian included the Patterson photograph in an exhibition titled 19th Century America: Life, Death, and Memory. The image was displayed with a detailed explanatory panel and excerpts from Margaret Patterson's diary. Visitors spent long minutes examining the photograph, many not immediately noticing the clenched fists until they read the accompanying text. Once pointed out, the detail became impossible to ignore, a small but profound indication that something was wrong with this seemingly ordinary family portrait. The photograph of Elizabeth Patterson, dead in her chair, hands frozen in rigor mortis, her living family arranged around her, had become a teaching tool, helping contemporary viewers understand a past that seemed increasingly foreign. a time when death occurred at home, when children witnessed their parents' corpses being posed for photographs, when families created elaborate rituals to cope with losses that occurred with devastating frequency. Elizabeth Patterson had died at 32, leaving behind a husband and 2 young children. 135 years later, her image remained, her clenched fists silently testifying to the physical reality of death and the lengths to which Victorian families went to preserve memory in the face of loss.